Picture this, a smoky saloon in the heart of Devil's Canyon, where the piano plays off-key melodies and desperate men drown their sorrows in rot-gut whiskey. The air thick with cigar smoke and broken dreams, where fortunes are lost at card tables and secrets are bought with gold. But tonight, all eyes are on the stage where a woman dances like her very soul depends on it. Rose Valentine wasn't supposed to be here. 3 months ago, she'd been Lady Rosalind Ashworth, daughter of English nobility, raised in marble halls with crystal chandeliers and servants who curtsied when she passed. She'd spoken French at breakfast, played piano sonatas in silk gowns, and never once imagined she'd end up twirling in a saloon dress cut so low it would have scandalized her governess. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. When your father's gambling debts catch up with him, when creditors come calling with threats instead of tea, when a midnight escape becomes your only chance at survival, well, sometimes a lady has to become something else entirely. Sometimes she has to learn to smile while men whistle and holler, to dance while her heart breaks, to pretend that Rose Valentine, the saloon girl, is all she's ever been. The thing about secrets, though, is that they have weight. They press down on your shoulders, change the way you carry yourself, shadow your eyes even when you're laughing. And Rose Valentine carried hers like a loaded gun. Dangerous, hidden, ready to explode if the wrong person discovered the truth. Tonight felt different, though. As Rose spun across the makeshift stage, her emerald dress catching the lamplight, she felt eyes on her that weren't like the others. Not hungry or crude or calculating, but curious, searching, as if someone was trying to see past the performance to the woman underneath. She completed her routine to the usual chorus of cheers and coin tossing, but her gaze kept drifting to the corner table where a stranger sat alone. He was tall, even sitting down, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that spoke of weeks on the trail. His clothes marked him as a cowboy, worn leather vest, faded shirt, gun belt that looked well used. But there was something in his bearing that suggested he was more than just another drifter. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and Rose felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving England. Recognition. Not of his face, but of something deeper. The look of someone else carrying secrets, someone else pretending to be something they weren't. He raised his whiskey glass slightly in what might have been a salute, and Rose found herself nodding back before she could think better of it. In that moment, the rowdy saloon seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them suspended in a bubble of understanding that scared her more than any debt collector ever could. Because Rose Valentine had learned that in a place like Devil's Canyon, trust was a luxury that could get you killed. And the stranger in the corner, with his knowing eyes and careful stillness, looked like exactly the kind of man who could unravel everything she'd worked so hard to hide. But as she descended from the stage, coins jingling in her skirts and the crowd already turning back to their cards and drinks, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed world was about to change. The stranger was still watching her, still seeing too much, and something deep in her chest whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was tired of running from who she really was. What she didn't know was that the man in the corner had secrets of his own, shadows in his past that made her hidden nobility seem like child's play. What she didn't know was that Daniel Morgan, the ghost of Colorado Territory, was in Devil's Canyon for reasons that had nothing to do with whiskey or poker and everything to do with the kind of justice that came at the end of a gun. And what neither of them knew was that their meeting would set in motion a chain of events that would test every assumption they'd made about love, loyalty, and the price of keeping secrets in a world where the truth could be the most dangerous weapon of all. This is the story of how a lady became a saloon girl, how a legend became a man, and how two people running from their pasts discovered that sometimes the most dangerous truth is the one that sets you free. Rose's hands were still trembling slightly as she made her way through the crowd toward the bar, the echo of applause and crude commentary following in her wake. 3 months of this life, and she still felt like she was playing a role in some twisted theater production, one where the audience could touch the performers and the script changed nightly depending on how much whiskey had been consumed. "Another fine performance, Rose," called out Big Jim Murphy, the saloon owner, his gold teeth gleaming in the lamplight. "That new dress is bringing in twice the usual take." Keep it up, and I might just give you a raise. Rose forced a smile that felt like broken glass. Much obliged, Mr. Murphy. The words came out in the careful frontier drawl she'd practiced for weeks, nothing like the crisp English accent that had once marked her as Lady Rosalind Ashworth. She was reaching for the glass of water she always kept behind the bar when a voice spoke quietly beside her. That was quite a show. Rose turned, and there he was, the stranger from the corner table, close enough now that she could see the details her stage performance had hidden. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black in the saloon's dim lighting, and they held an intelligence that made her instinctively cautious. There was something about the way he stood, balanced and ready, that spoke of a man accustomed to violence even when he appeared relaxed. Thank you kindly, Rose replied, maintaining her role even as every instinct screamed at her to be careful. Though I reckon you've seen better dancing in fancier places than Devil's Canyon. Maybe, the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested years of dust and hard living. But I've never seen anyone dance like they were trying to outrun their own shadow. The observation hit too close to home, and Rose felt her carefully constructed mask slip for just a moment. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Those knowing eyes had caught the flicker of recognition, the brief glimpse of the woman beneath the performance. Name's Daniel Morgan, he said, extending a calloused hand, and you don't have to keep pretending with me. I know what it looks like when someone's running from something. Rose hesitated before taking his hand, surprised by the gentleness of his grip despite the obvious strength there. Rose Valentine, she replied, giving him the name that had become her armor, and I'm not running from anything. This is just where life landed me. Daniel's smile was knowing but not unkind. Life has a funny way of landing people exactly where they need to be, don't you think? Before Rose could respond, a commotion erupted from one of the poker tables. Chairs scraped back, voices raised in anger, and Rose saw the telltale signs of trouble brewing. In a place like Murphy's Saloon, disagreements had a way of escalating quickly and violently. Cheater! Someone shouted, and Rose winced as she recognized the voice of Jake Hastings, a local rancher who drank too much and lost too often. Nobody's luck is that good. The accused was a thin man in a fancy vest whom Rose had never seen before, probably a traveling gambler who'd made the mistake of winning too much too quickly. In Devil's Canyon, that was as good as signing your own death warrant. Gentlemen, gentlemen, Murphy called out, but his voice lacked conviction. Rose knew he was calculating whether a fight would be good or bad for business. Daniel was already moving before the first punch was thrown. Rose watched in amazement as he stepped between the two men with the easy confidence of someone who'd broken up more than his share of barroom brawls. Now, boys, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the tension, seems to me this is just a misunderstanding. Why don't we all take a breath and... Hastings swung at him instead, a wild haymaker fueled by whiskey and wounded pride. Daniel caught the punch with one hand, twisted slightly, and suddenly Hastings was on his knees, with his arm bent at an uncomfortable angle behind his back. Like I was saying, Daniel continued conversationally, misunderstandings happen. Maybe Mr. Hastings here just needs some fresh air to clear his head. The would-be cheater was already backing toward the door, clearly recognizing his chance to escape while Daniel had things under control. Rose found herself impressed despite her wariness. It took skill and experience to defuse a situation like that without making it worse. Daniel released Hastings, who stumbled to his feet muttering curses, but clearly unwilling to press his luck against someone who'd handled him so easily. Within moments, the crisis had passed, and the saloon was returning to its normal level of controlled chaos. That was well done, Rose said when Daniel returned to her side at the bar. You've got experience keeping the peace. Some, Daniel replied, accepting the whiskey Murphy had poured as a thank you. Though I've found that preventing fights is usually easier than winning them. Rose studied his profile as he drank, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging threats and exits. This was a man who'd lived a dangerous life, someone accustomed to violence even if he preferred to avoid it. So what brings you to Devil's Canyon, Mr. Morgan? She asked, genuinely curious now. This isn't exactly on the main trail to anywhere important. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Rose saw something flicker across his features, pain maybe, or regret. Sometimes a man needs to be somewhere that isn't anywhere important, he said finally. Sometimes he needs to disappear for a while. And sometimes a woman does too, Rose replied before she could stop herself. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, Rose felt a connection she hadn't experienced since leaving England. The recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else carrying the weight of secrets, and the exhaustion of constantly pretending to be someone else. Rose! Murphy's voice cut through the moment like a rusty blade. Table 6 is asking for you specifically. Better go earn your keep. Rose's stomach clenched as she glanced toward Table 6, where 3 men in expensive suits sat with the predatory stillness of vultures. She recognized the type. Men with money and power who viewed saloon girls as entertainment they could purchase by the hour. Of course, Mr. Murphy, she said, the trained response automatic, even as everything inside her rebelled. But as she started to move away from the bar, Daniel's hand touched her arm gently. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, he said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised her. Rose looked at him sharply. This is my job, Mr. Morgan. We all do things we don't want to do to survive. Survival's important, Daniel agreed, but so is keeping your soul intact. For a moment, Rose forgot where she was, forgot the persona she constructed, forgot everything except the way this stranger was looking at her. Not as Rose Valentine, the saloon girl, but as someone worth protecting. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as anything other than entertainment or a problem to be solved. Rose! Murphy's voice was sharper now, carrying a warning edge. I have to go, Rose said, but she found herself reluctant to leave Daniel's side. I'll be right here, he promised, and something in his tone made Rose believe he meant it in more ways than one. As she walked toward Table 6, her heart hammering with the familiar mixture of dread and determination, Rose found herself thinking about Daniel Morgan's words. She'd survived this long by doing whatever was necessary, by burying Lady Rosalind so deep that sometimes she forgot that woman had ever existed. But now, with Daniel's eyes on her back and his quiet promise echoing in her ears, Rose wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was another way to survive, a way that didn't require her to lose pieces of herself every night. The men at Table 6 looked up as she approached, their smiles sharp with expectation and entitlement. But for the first time in 3 months, Rose Valentine stood a little straighter, held her head a little higher, and remembered what it felt like to be worthy of protection. Behind her, she could feel Daniel's presence like a shield, and for the first time since arriving in Devil's Canyon, Rose allowed herself to hope that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Some connections, she realized, were worth the risk of letting someone see who you really were, even if that truth could destroy everything you'd worked to build. The men at Table 6 looked like money, the kind that bought silence as easily as whiskey. The leader was a portly man with silver hair and cold blue eyes that appraised Rose like she was livestock at auction. His companions were younger, harder, with the kind of smiles that never reached their eyes. Well, well, the silver-haired man drawled as Rose approached, his voice carrying the cultured tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You must be the famous Rose Valentine we've been hearing about. I'm Augustus Blackwood, and these are my associates. The name hit Rose like a physical blow, though she fought to keep her expression neutral. Blackwood, she knew that name from her father's frantic midnight conversations, from the letters that had arrived with increasing frequency before their desperate flight from England. Augustus Blackwood wasn't just wealthy, he was one of the most powerful men in the American West, with interests in mining, railroads, and businesses that operated in the shadows between legal and criminal. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blackwood, Rose managed, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. What can I bring you gentlemen this evening? Blackwood's smile was predatory. Oh, my dear, we're not interested in drinks. We've come a very long way to have a conversation with you about your previous circumstances. Rose's blood turned to ice water. They knew, somehow impossibly, they'd found her despite all her precautions, all her careful reinvention. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, sir. Come now, Lady Rosalind, Blackwood said softly, and the use of her real name was like a knife between her ribs. Or do you prefer to be called by your father's title? The late Earl of Ashworth had such interesting financial arrangements. Rose forced herself not to look toward the bar where Daniel waited, not to give away the one person who might represent safety in this nightmare. I think you have me confused with someone else. 30,000 pounds, Blackwood continued as if she hadn't spoken. That's what your dear father owed me when he decided to take his own life rather than face the consequences. A debt that, according to English law, passes to his surviving heir. The words hit Rose like physical blows. She'd known her father was in debt, known that was why they'd fled England in the dark of night, but she'd never known the extent of it, never known that his death, which she'd been told was an accident, had been suicide. I don't have that kind of money, Rose whispered, abandoning pretense. What was the point now? No, Blackwood agreed, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. But you have other assets. Youth, beauty, breeding, all very valuable in the right markets. One of his companions leaned forward, his smile revealing gold teeth. Boss has operations all over the territory, mining camps that need entertainment, rich men in San Francisco who pay well for educated companionship. Rose understood the implications perfectly, and nausea rolled through her stomach. They weren't just talking about saloon work. They were talking about something far worse, far more final. I need time to think, she said, backing away from the table. Time is a luxury you don't have, Blackwood replied smoothly. My associates will escort you to your room to collect your things. We leave in the morning. Like hell you do. The voice came from directly behind Rose, and she spun to find Daniel standing there. His relaxed posture from earlier was gone, replaced by something coiled and dangerous. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but there was nothing casual about the look in his eyes. Blackwood's expression shifted to one of mild annoyance. This doesn't concern you, cowboy. Walk away while you still can. Funny thing about me, Daniel said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made the hair on Rose's arm stand up. I don't walk away from bullies, especially ones who make their living off women who can't defend themselves. The gold-toothed man started to rise from his chair, but Daniel's gun was in his hand before the man had moved 6 inches, drawn so fast that Rose barely saw the motion. I wouldn't, Daniel said conversationally. See, I've been having a really good evening until you boys showed up. Made a new friend, prevented one fight already. I'd hate to have to kill someone and ruin the mood. Blackwood studied Daniel with new interest, his businessman's eyes calculating odds and risks. You're very fast with that iron, professional fast. What's your name, gunfighter? Daniel Morgan, Daniel replied, and Rose saw recognition flicker in Blackwood's eyes. The ghost, Blackwood breathed. I should have known. Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Morgan. The ghost. Rose had heard whispers of that name in the months since arriving in the territory. Stories of a gunfighter who moved like smoke, appeared where he was needed, and disappeared just as quickly. Some said he was a fallen lawman seeking redemption. Others claimed he was death himself, come to balance the scales of frontier justice. My reputation's got nothing to do with this, Daniel said. What matters is that the lady doesn't want to go with you. And I'm inclined to help her stay exactly where she is. Blackwood's smile was thin and cold. This woman owes me a considerable debt, Mr. Morgan. I'm simply collecting what's mine. Debt or no debt, Daniel replied, his gun never wavering. She's not property to be collected, and any man who treats her like she is will have to go through me first. The tension in the saloon had shifted, conversations dying as other patrons realized something serious was happening. Rose could see Murphy watching from behind the bar, his face pale with the understanding that his establishment was about to become a battleground. You're making a mistake, Ghost, Blackwood said, rising slowly from his chair. I have resources, connections. Men like you end up dead in ditches when they cross men like me. Daniel's smile was sharp as a blade. Men like you end up dead in saloons when they threaten women under my protection. Under his protection? The words sent a warmth through Rose's chest even as fear continued to claw at her throat. She'd been alone for so long, fighting her battles with nothing but desperation and stubborn pride. To have someone, especially someone with Daniel's reputation, stand between her and danger felt like a miracle. This isn't over, Blackwood said, gesturing to his men. Come morning, We'll be back with more men and legal papers. Enjoy your last night of freedom, Rosalind." As the three men filed out of the saloon, Rose felt her legs go weak. Daniel was beside her instantly, his arm steadying her. "Easy," he murmured. "They're gone for now." "They'll be back," Rose whispered, "and they'll bring an army with them." "You don't know what kind of man Augustus Blackwood is." "Maybe not," Daniel agreed, "but he doesn't know what kind of man I am either." Rose looked up at him, seeing something in his expression that both comforted and terrified her. "Why are you doing this?" "You don't owe me anything." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "Maybe I do," he said finally. "Maybe we all owe each other more than we think." He guided her to a chair, then sat across from her, his presence solid and reassuring even as chaos swirled in her mind. "Tell me about your father," he said gently. "Tell me what really happened." Rose closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 months of carefully guarded secrets pressing against her chest. "He wasn't a good man," she said finally. "He gambled, drank, made deals with people like Blackwood. When it all came crashing down, when the debts became too much." She opened her eyes, meeting Daniel's steady gaze. "He took the coward's way out and left me to clean up the mess." "That's not your fault." "Tell that to Augustus Blackwood," Rose replied bitterly. "In his mind, I'm responsible for every penny my father owed." Daniel leaned forward, his voice intense. "Listen to me, Rose. Rosalind. Whoever you want to be. Your father's debts died with him. No law in this territory says you have to pay for his mistakes. Blackwood doesn't care about territory law. He makes his own rules. Then we'll have to make some new ones," Daniel said. And there was something in his tone that made Rose believe he might actually be capable of it. As the night wore on and the saloon gradually emptied, Rose found herself telling Daniel things she'd never told anyone. About the midnight flight from England, about watching her entire world collapse in a matter of weeks, about the terrifying transformation from Lady Rosalind Ashworth to Rose Valentine. And slowly, carefully, Daniel began to share pieces of his own story. About a badge he'd once worn, about justice that had failed, about choosing to become the ghost because sometimes the law wasn't enough to protect the innocent. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Rose realized that the most dangerous thing about Daniel Morgan wasn't his reputation with a gun. It was the way he made her want to stop running, to stand and fight for the first time in her life. "What happens now?" she asked as they sat in the empty saloon, watching the sunrise paint the windows gold. Daniel's smile was fierce and certain. "Now we get ready for war." The morning sun hadn't fully cleared the eastern peaks when Daniel spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. He'd been expecting it. Men like Augustus Blackwood didn't make idle threats. But the size of the approaching party made his jaw tighten. 12 riders, maybe more, all heading straight for Devil's Canyon, with the purposeful gait of men on a mission. Rose stood beside him on the saloon's second-floor balcony, her face pale but determined. She'd traded her emerald performance dress for a practical riding skirt and white blouse that somehow made her look more like the English lady she'd been born to be. But there was steel in her spine now that hadn't been there yesterday, a resolve that spoke of a woman who decided to stop running. "That's a lot of men," she said quietly, watching the dust cloud grow larger. "Blackwood's not taking any chances this time," Daniel agreed. "Question is, are you ready for what comes next?" Rose was quiet for a moment, her fingers gripping the balcony railing. 3 months ago, I would have said no. 3 months ago, I would have packed what little I owned and run as far as these mountains would carry me. She turned to look at him, her green eyes blazing with something fierce and new. "But I'm tired of running from my father's mistakes. I'm tired of being afraid." Daniel nodded, studying her face. The transformation was remarkable. In less than 24 hours, Rose Valentine, the desperate saloon girl, had begun to reclaim pieces of Lady Rosalind Ashworth. But more than that, she was becoming someone entirely new, forged in the crucible of frontier necessity and tempered by her own courage. "There's something you need to know," Daniel said, his voice carrying a weight that made Rose turn to face him fully, "about why I'm really here in Devil's Canyon." Rose waited, sensing that whatever he was about to tell her would change everything between them. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant with memory. "5 years ago, I wore a badge," federal marshal for the Colorado Territory. I believed in law and order, believed that justice could be found in courtrooms and judges' gavels. His laugh was bitter. I was young and stupid and idealistic as hell. What changed? Rose asked softly. Augustus Blackwood, Daniel replied, the name falling between them like a stone into still water. He'd been operating in my territory for months, kidnapping women, forcing them into brothels, selling them like cattle to mining camps and railroad crews. I spent 2 years building a case against him, gathering witnesses, collecting evidence. Rose felt ice form in her stomach. What happened? The day before the trial, every witness disappeared. Some were found dead in ditches. Others just vanished completely. The judge, a man I'd known for years, a man I trusted, suddenly declared that there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. Daniel's hands clenched into fists on the railing. 2 days later, that same judge bought a mansion in San Francisco with cash. Blackwood bought the whole system, Rose breathed, lock, stock, and barrel. And I realized that sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes a man has to step outside the boundaries of what's legal to do what's right. Daniel turned to meet her eyes. That's when Daniel Morgan, the federal marshal, died, and the ghost was born. Rose reached out instinctively, her hand covering his on the railing. How many others have you helped? Enough to know that Blackwood's operation is bigger than anyone realizes. He's got judges, sheriffs, politicians in his pocket from here to California. Women disappear into his network and are never seen again. Daniel's voice was hard as granite. But he made a mistake when he came after you. What mistake? Daniel's smile was sharp and dangerous. He gave me a reason to stop hunting his organization from the shadows and face him directly. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Rose could see individual riders now, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. Blackwood rode at their head, flanked by men who looked more like military soldiers than typical hired guns. Daniel, Rose said suddenly, her voice urgent, there's something I need to tell you too. About why Blackwood wants me specifically. Daniel looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Rose took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to reveal would put both their lives in even greater danger. My father wasn't just a gambling man with debts. He was one of Blackwood's business partners. The money he owed wasn't from cards or dice. It was from a deal gone wrong. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What kind of deal? Human trafficking, Rose whispered, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. My father provided information about wealthy English families with young daughters. Blackwood would arrange for the girls to be kidnapped during accidents or disappearances while traveling. They'd be shipped to America and sold to his network. The horror of it settled over Daniel like a cold blanket. Your own father was selling children into slavery. 27 girls, Rose said, tears streaming down her face. I found the records before we fled England. 27 young women who disappeared because my father gave Blackwood their names, their travel schedules, their vulnerabilities. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. That's why he wants you alive. You're not just a debt to be collected, you're proof of his operation, evidence that could bring down his entire network. And I'm the daughter of his former partner, Rose added. In his twisted mind, I'm his property by inheritance and by right. The riders were close enough now to make out individual faces. Rose could see Blackwood's cold blue eyes fixed on the saloon, could see the predatory satisfaction in his expression. He knew he had her trapped. There's more, Rose said quickly, knowing their time was running out. In my father's papers, there were names. American officials, judges, railroad executives, everyone who was helping Blackwood move stolen women across state lines. Daniel's head snapped toward her. You have proof? Written evidence? Hidden in a place where only I can retrieve it, Rose replied. That's the real reason I can't run anymore. Those names are the only thing that can bring justice for all those girls. Daniel stared at her for a moment, then began to laugh. Not with humor, but with the kind of fierce joy that comes from finally seeing a way to win an impossible fight. Rose, he said, his voice filled with something that might have been reverence. You're not just running from your past anymore. You're carrying the key to destroying Blackwood's entire operation. If we can survive long enough to use it, Rose replied, watching the riders spread out to surround the saloon. Daniel checked his guns, his movements quick and efficient. How long would it take you to retrieve those papers? 2 days hard riding north to the old mining claim, where I buried them. Then that's what we're going to do. Daniel's smile was sharp as a blade. But first we need to convince Mr. Blackwood that chasing us is going to be more expensive than he bargained for. Below them, the riders had formed a loose circle around the saloon. Blackwood himself remained mounted in the center of the street, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Miss Ashworth," he called out, "I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer. Come down now and we can settle this matter like civilized people." Daniel stepped to the edge of the balcony, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Seems to me the lady already gave you her answer yesterday." Blackwood's cold smile widened. "Ah, the famous ghost. I've brought some friends who've been eager to meet you. Federal Marshal Thompson, say hello." One of the riders urged his horse forward, and Rose saw the badge glinting on his vest. But there was something wrong with the man's posture, something that spoke of corruption rather than justice. "Daniel Morgan," the false marshal called out, "you're under arrest for the murder of Judge Harrison in Colorado Springs." Daniel's laugh was harsh. "Judge Harrison died in his sleep, Thompson. We both know it." "Funny thing about evidence," Thompson replied. "Sometimes it appears when you need it most. Witnesses who swear they saw you leaving the judge's house. A smoking gun with your fingerprints." Rose felt sick. "They're framing you." "Of course they are," Daniel replied calmly. "Question is, are you ready to become an outlaw, Lady Rosalind?" Rose looked down at Blackwood, at his army of corrupt lawmen and hired killers, at the faces of men who trafficked in human misery for profit. Then she looked at Daniel, at the man who'd risked everything to protect her, who'd chosen to become something dark and dangerous so that justice could still exist in a world where the law had been bought and sold. "I've been an outlaw since the day I ran from England," she said firmly. "The only difference is, now I'm choosing to fight back." Daniel's smile was brilliant and proud. "In that case, I suggest we give these gentlemen something to remember us by before we leave." He drew his gun with that lightning-fast motion that had made him legendary, and Rose felt her heart swell with something that might have been love, or might have been the intoxicating rush of finally choosing to stand and fight instead of run and hide. Below them, Blackwood's army tensed, ready for battle, and on the balcony above, two people who'd been running from their pasts prepared to face their future together, whatever the cost. The war for Rose's freedom and for the lives of 27 missing girls was about to begin. The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. 12 armed men below facing two people on a balcony with nowhere to run. Rose could feel Daniel's tension beside her, coiled and ready like a predator preparing to strike. Below, Blackwood sat his horse with the satisfied smile of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Last chance, Miss Ashworth," Blackwood called up. "Come down peacefully and I'll make sure your friend here gets a quick trial before his hanging." Daniel's response was to shift slightly, his body positioning, putting him between Rose and the guns below. The protective gesture sent warmth through her chest even as fear clawed at her throat. "I've got a counter-offer," Daniel called down, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "You and your boys ride out now, and I won't have to kill half of you before breakfast." Blackwood's laugh was genuinely amused. 12-2, Mr. Morgan. Even the famous ghost can't beat those odds." "Maybe not," Daniel agreed. "But the question is, which two of your men are you willing to sacrifice? Because I promise you, Blackwood, the first shots I fire are going to put bullets in you and that fake marshal of yours." Rose saw the calculation flicker across Blackwood's face. He was a businessman at heart, and businessmen understood cost-benefit analysis. Losing hired guns was acceptable. Losing himself was not. "What's your play?" Rose whispered urgently. "Back door," Daniel murmured without moving his lips. "Murphy's got a stable out back with fresh horses. Soon as the shooting starts, you run like hell." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." But Rose could hear the lie in his voice. Daniel was planning to hold them off while she escaped, probably planning to die doing it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This man, who barely knew her, was prepared to sacrifice his life for her freedom. "No," she said firmly. "Rose, I said no." She moved to stand beside him instead of behind him, her chin raised defiantly. "We face this together, or not at all." Daniel looked at her, saw the stubborn determination in her green eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. "You sure about this? Once the shooting starts, there's no going back." "I've been sure since the moment you stood up to them yesterday." Rose reached under her skirt and pulled out a small derringer she'd hidden there. Murphy had insisted all his girls carry protection, though she'd never imagined she'd need it like this. "Besides, you're not the only one with secrets, Mr. Morgan." Daniel's smile was fierce and proud. "In that case, Lady Ashworth, let's give these bastards a fight they'll remember." The first shot came from one of Blackwood's men, nervous and jumpy, his bullet splintering the wood inches from Daniel's head. But Daniel was already moving, his Colt appearing in his hand as if by magic, his first shot taking the shooter clean off his horse. Chaos erupted in the street below. Horses reared and screamed as gunfire exploded from all directions. Rose's derringer barked twice, her shots careful and precise. She learned to shoot as a child, though her tutors had never imagined she'd use the skill in a gunfight. Daniel was a revelation in motion, his gun switching from target to target with deadly precision. Rose watched in amazement as he worked, understanding now why men called him the Ghost. He seemed to anticipate where each shot was coming from, moving like smoke, never staying in one place long enough for return fire to find him. But they were still outnumbered, and ammunition wasn't unlimited. "Time to go," Daniel shouted, grabbing Rose's hand. They ran for the back stairs as bullets chewed through the balcony behind them. Rose's skirts tangled around her legs, slowing her down, and she cursed the propriety that had made her dress like a lady when what she needed was to move like a fighter. The saloon's back door opened onto an alley where Murphy had indeed prepared horses, two of them saddled and ready. The old saloon keeper stood in the doorway, his face grim but resolute. "Figured you might need these," Murphy said, tossing Daniel a rifle and a bag of ammunition. "That woman's been good for business, and I don't hold with men like Blackwood." "Much obliged," Daniel said, helping Rose into the saddle. But before they could spur their horses, Blackwood himself appeared at the mouth of the alley, flanked by four of his men. His face was twisted with rage, his pristine businessman's composure finally cracking. "You've cost me good men, Ghost," he snarled, his gun trained on Daniel. "But it ends here." "Does it?" Daniel asked conversationally, and Rose caught the subtle signal he made with his left hand. Murphy's shotgun roared from the doorway, catching one of Blackwood's men's center mass and spinning him like a rag doll. In the same instant, Daniel's horse reared, hooves flashing toward Blackwood's face, forcing the man to dodge backward. "Go!" Daniel shouted, and Rose spurred her horse forward. They thundered out of the alley and into the main street, where the remaining members of Blackwood's crew scrambled for their horses. Gunfire erupted behind them as they galloped through the canyon, bullets whining off rocks and kicking up dirt around their horses' hooves. Rose bent low over her horse's neck, feeling the animal's powerful muscles surge beneath her as they climbed the narrow trail out of Devil's Canyon. Behind her, she could hear Daniel returning fire, his shots carefully placed to discourage pursuit without wasting ammunition. "This way!" Daniel called, veering off the main trail onto a barely visible deer path that wound through thick pine forest. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the sound of pursuit gradually fading behind them as they climbed higher into the mountains. Finally, when both horses were lathered with sweat and blowing hard, Daniel called a halt beside a small stream that trickled down from the peaks above. Rose dismounted on shaking legs, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She'd never been in a gunfight before, had never felt the peculiar mixture of terror and exhilaration that came from facing death and emerging victorious. Her hands were trembling, but she felt more alive than she had in months. "You did good back there," Daniel said, checking his horse's hooves for stones. "That little pop gun of yours saved my life at least twice." Rose looked down at the derringer in her hand, surprised to realize she was still holding it. "I killed a man," she said quietly. Daniel paused in his examination of the horse. "Does that bother you?" Rose considered the question seriously, thinking about the man she'd shot, about the 27 girls whose disappearance her father had facilitated, about all the women Blackwood's organization had brutalized and destroyed. "No," she said finally, "it doesn't. Is that terrible?" "It's honest," Daniel replied. "And in a world where men like Blackwood exist, sometimes honest violence is the only answer to dishonest evil." They rested the horses for 20 minutes, sharing water from Daniel's canteen and checking their weapons. Rose had learned to reload the Derringer during their flight, her movements becoming more confident with practice. "How far to where you buried the evidence?" Daniel asked as they prepared to mount up again. "Another day and a half if we push hard," Rose replied. "It's an old silver claim my father bought as a backup plan. He never imagined I'd be the one retrieving what he hid there." Daniel helped her back into the saddle, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. "Rose," he said quietly, "what we're doing, it's not just dangerous, it's probably suicide. Blackwood's got resources we can't match, connections that reach all the way to Washington. Even if we get the evidence, there's no guarantee we'll live long enough to use it." Rose looked down at him, seeing the concern in his dark eyes, the way he was trying to give her one last chance to back out. "Daniel," she said softly, "3 days ago I was dancing in a saloon, pretending to be someone else, slowly dying inside from shame and fear. Today I shot a man who was trying to enslave women, and I felt proud of it. If this is suicide, at least I'll die as myself." Daniel's smile was brilliant. "In that case, Lady Rosalind, let's go change the world." They rode north through country that grew progressively wilder and more dangerous. This was territory where the law was whatever a man could enforce with his gun, where Apache war parties still roamed, and where claim jumpers shot first and asked questions never. But Rose found herself oddly unafraid. With Daniel beside her, armed and dangerous and deadly competent, she felt safer than she had since leaving England. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, they made camp in a sheltered grove beside a small lake. Daniel built a small, smokeless fire while Rose tended to the horses, marveling at how quickly she was adapting to this new life. "Tell me about the girl," Daniel said as they shared beans and hardtack from his saddlebags, "the ones your father helped disappear." Rose was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Most of them were younger than me. Daughters of merchants and minor nobles, girls whose families had money but not enough power to investigate properly when they disappeared. My father would find out which ones were traveling, which coaches they'd be taking when they'd be most vulnerable. And Blackwood's men would stage accidents, robberies usually. The girl would be killed along with everyone else, but her body would never be found. Meanwhile, she'd be transported to America under a false name, probably drugged to keep her compliant." Rose's hands clenched into fists. By the time they reached places like Blackwood's brothels or mining camps, they'd be so broken and terrified that resistance seemed impossible. Daniel was quiet for a long time, his face hard in the firelight. 27 girls. That we know of. There could be more. Rose looked up at him. "Do you think we can really stop him? Really bring him to justice?" Daniel reached across the fire and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong. "Rose, I've spent 5 years hunting men like Blackwood. I've seen what they're capable of, how deep their corruption runs. But I've also learned that sometimes one person willing to stand up and fight can bring down an entire criminal empire." "Just one person?" "Well," Daniel said, his smile gentle and fierce, "in this case, it's 2 people. And I like our odds a lot better with you beside me." As they settled in for the night, taking turns on watch, Rose reflected on how completely her life had changed. Yesterday, she'd been a saloon girl hiding from her past. Tonight, she was an outlaw riding toward a confrontation that could either bring justice to dozens of victims or get them both killed. But for the first time since fleeing England, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, mist rising from the lake like the ghosts of broken dreams. Rose woke to find Daniel already up, checking their back trail with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years looking over his shoulder. His dark hair was tousled from sleep, his face bearing the stubble of 2 days without a razor. But there was something magnificent about him in the pale morning light, like a fallen angel who'd chosen his own damnation rather than surrender his principles. Any sign of pursuit? Rose asked, rising from her bedroll and immediately missing the warmth of the blankets. Not yet, Daniel replied, lowering the spyglass he'd been using. But Blackwood's not the type to give up easy. We've got maybe half a day before they pick up our trail again. Rose nodded, already moving to break camp with the efficiency she'd learned in their short time together. Amazing how quickly a person could adapt when survival depended on it. 3 days ago, she'd needed help lacing her corset. This morning, she could saddle a horse, load a gun, and pack supplies faster than most men. They rode hard through country that grew progressively more desolate as they climbed toward the old mining claim. The trees thinned, replaced by rocky outcroppings and scrub brush that offered little cover from watching eyes. Rose found herself studying the landscape with new awareness, seeing it not as scenery but as potential battlefield, places where enemies could hide, routes of escape if things went wrong. There, Rose said as they crested a ridge, pointing toward a narrow valley carved into the mountainside. Silver Creek Claim. My father bought it from a prospector who swore there was still ore in those hills. Daniel studied the abandoned mining operation through his spyglass. Rough wooden buildings, weathered gray by mountain winters. A mine shaft that gaped like a wound in the hillside. Equipment rusted and forgotten. It looked like a ghost town, which was probably exactly what Rose's father had wanted. Perfect place to hide something you never want found, Daniel observed. They approached cautiously, Daniel's hand never straying far from his gun. But the claim appeared genuinely deserted, occupied only by chipmunks and the occasional hawk circling overhead. The silence was complete except for the whisper of wind through abandoned structures. Rose dismounted near what had once been the main office building, her heart hammering with anticipation and dread. It's in here, she said, pushing open a door that squealed in protest on rusted hinges. The interior was thick with dust and spider webs, furniture covered with years of accumulated grime. But Rose moved with purpose, heading straight for a filing cabinet in the corner. She knelt beside it, running her hands along the base until she found what she was looking for. A loose floorboard that had been carefully cut and replaced. "Help me with this," she said, and Daniel knelt beside her, their shoulders touching as they pried up the board. Beneath was a metal strongbox, locked and sealed with wax to keep out moisture. Rose's hands trembled as she produced a key from around her neck, one she'd worn like a millstone since fleeing England. The box opened with a soft click. Inside were documents that would topple governments and hang men in high places. Lists of names, dates, financial records, correspondence, all in her father's meticulous handwriting. Rose pulled out a leather portfolio, opening it to reveal page after page of damning evidence. "My God," Daniel breathed, reading over her shoulder. "This isn't just about the missing girls. Blackwood's been running slaves through 3 states, bribing federal judges, selling women to railroad crews and mining camps from Colorado to California." Rose nodded grimly, turning pages that documented a network of corruption so vast it staggered the imagination. Senator Morrison, Judge Patterson, Marshall Williams, men I remember meeting at dinner parties in England, men who seemed so respectable. Daniel's finger traced down a list of payments. $200,000 to fix court cases. $50,000 to ensure certain evidence disappeared. Christ, Rose, this is enough to bring down half the territorial government. But Rose had found something else in the box, something that made her blood run cold. A letter in her father's handwriting, addressed to her. "My dearest Rosalind, if you are reading this, then the worst has come to pass, and I have taken the coward's way out rather than face the consequences of my actions. I know you will hate me for what I have done, for the lives I have destroyed, for the shame I have brought upon our family name. But perhaps if you are brave enough to use what is contained herein, you can find some measure of redemption for the sins I have committed. The girl I raised would have the courage to do what I could not, to face the truth and make it right, whatever the cost. Be strong, my darling. Be better than your father ever was." The Earl of Ashworth. Tears blurred Rose's vision as she finished reading. Even in death, her father was asking her to clean up his messes, to risk her life for his mistakes. But this time, she realized, she wasn't doing it for him. She was doing it for the 27 girls whose names were carefully documented in his records, for all the women who had suffered because powerful men believed they were untouchable. Rose, Daniel said softly, his hand warm on her shoulder. You don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted, wiping her eyes with determination. This is who I am now. Not Lady Rosalind Ashworth, not Rose Valentine the saloon girl, but someone new, someone who chooses to fight. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. Then slowly he reached up and touched her cheek, his callous thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized was there. I've never met anyone like you, he said softly. When I first saw you dancing in that saloon, I thought you were just another lost soul trying to survive. But you're not lost, are you? You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Rose felt her breath catch in her throat, the way Daniel was looking at her, not with desire or pity or the calculating assessment she was used to from men, but with something deeper. Recognition, admiration, maybe even, Daniel, she whispered. I know this is crazy, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I know we've only known each other 3 days. I know we're probably going to die trying to use this evidence. But Rose, she silenced him by rising up on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, then deeper as Daniel's arms came around her, pulling her close. She could taste dust and danger on his lips, could feel the strength in his embrace, and for a moment the abandoned mining office became the most romantic place in the world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I know it's impossible and probably stupid, but I love you. Rose felt her heart soar, even as reality crashed back around them. I love you too, she whispered, which is why we're going to survive this. We're going to get this evidence to someone who can use it, and we're going to build a life together somewhere Blackwood can never find us. Daniel's smile was fierce and tender. Lady Rosalind Ashworth, you are the most dangerous woman I've ever met. Good, Rose replied, beginning to pack the documents back into the strongbox. Because Augustus Blackwood is about to learn that some people can't be bought, can't be broken, and can't be silenced. They secured the evidence carefully, dividing the most important documents between their saddlebags to ensure that if one of them was caught, the other could still complete the mission. As they prepared to leave the mining claim, Rose took one last look around the abandoned office where her father had hidden his guilty secrets. Goodbye, Papa, she said quietly. I'm going to finish what you were too cowardly to do. They mounted their horses and rode out of the valley, but they'd barely cleared the ridge when Daniel suddenly reined in his horse, his hand going to his gun. What is it? Rose asked. Listen. Rose strained her ears and heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. A lot of hoofbeats getting closer. How many? She asked, checking her derringer. Daniel was already scanning the terrain, looking for defensible positions. Too many. Blackwood must have split his men into search parties, had them covering all the likely hiding places. Can we outrun them? Not with tired horses and them knowing the country? Daniel's expression was grim but determined. Looks like this is where we make our stand. Rose felt fear and exhilaration war in her chest. They had the evidence now, proof that could bring justice to dozens of victims and topple a criminal empire. But first they had to survive long enough to use it. Daniel, she said as they sought cover among the rocks above the trail, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, he interrupted fiercely. But if it does, Rose continued, promise me you'll get those documents to someone who can use them. Promise me those girls won't have died for nothing. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, seeing the courage and determination that had transformed a frightened refugee into a warrior willing to die for justice. I promise, he said, but Rose, when we get out of this, when we bring Blackwood down and make him pay for what he's done, marry me. Rose's smile was brilliant, even as gunshots began to ring out from the trail below. Daniel Morgan, she said, raising her derringer, I thought you'd never ask. The final battle for Rose's freedom, for the evidence that could change everything, was about to begin. And this time, they were fighting not just for survival, but for love, for justice, and for the chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of their broken past. Below them, Blackwood's men were climbing toward their position, guns drawn and murder in their hearts. But above them, two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances, prepared to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world was a man and woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The first bullets came whistling up from the trail below, chipping rock inches from Rose's head and sending granite fragments flying like deadly confetti. She pressed herself deeper into the crevice between two boulders, her heart hammering against her ribs as Daniel returned fire with methodical precision. "How many?" Rose called out, checking the loads in her derringer. "8 that I can see," Daniel replied, his colt barking as he picked off a man trying to flank them from the left. "Maybe more using the rocks for cover." Rose peered around her boulder and spotted movement among the scrub brush 50 yards down the slope. Without hesitation, she aimed her little gun and fired, satisfaction coursing through her as she heard a yelp of pain and saw the bushes stop moving. "Nice shot," Daniel said with fierce pride. "You're getting dangerous with that pop gun." "I had a good teacher," Rose replied, reloading with steady hands despite the chaos around them. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, Lady Rosalind Ashworth of Devonshire, crouched behind a rock in the Colorado Territory, shooting at criminals like some character from a dime novel. 3 months ago, her greatest concern had been choosing the proper gloves for afternoon tea. Now she was in a gunfight that would determine the fate of dozens of enslaved women and the future of her own hard-won love. "Rose!" Daniel's voice was sharp with warning. She spun to see Augustus Blackwood himself climbing up the backside of their position, having circled around while his men kept them pinned down. His expensive suit was torn and dusty, his silver hair disheveled, but his cold blue eyes burned with the fury of a man who wasn't accustomed to being defied. "End of the trail, Miss Ashworth," Blackwood said, his gun trained on her. "Time to settle accounts." But Rose had been expecting this moment, had known that Blackwood's pride would demand a personal confrontation. She'd positioned herself with multiple escape routes, and now she rolled behind another boulder just as his shot shattered the rock where her head had been. "You missed," she called out sweetly. "Father always said you were better at bribing people than shooting them." Blackwood's snarl of rage was audible even over the continuing gunfire. "Your father was a weak fool who couldn't stomach what needed to be done. But you're going to pay for every dollar he cost me, every man you've killed, every day you've made me chase you across this godforsaken territory." Daniel was trying to get a clear shot at Blackwood, but the businessman had chosen his position well, using the terrain to stay protected while he stalked Rose. She could hear him moving, boots scraping on rock as he closed the distance. "Tell me something, Blackwood," Rose called out, buying time while she planned her next move. "How do you sleep at night knowing you've destroyed so many lives? Do you dream about the girls you've stolen, the families you've broken?" "I sleep very well," Blackwood replied, his voice getting closer, "on silk sheets purchased with the profits from giving people what they want. Supply and demand, my dear. It's the most natural law in the world." "And what about justice? Is that natural too?" Blackwood's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Justice is what men with money and power say it is, and I have both in abundance." Rose heard his footsteps pause, knew he was preparing to round her boulder and end this face-to-face. She took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods protected desperate women and righteous fools, and made her move. Instead of waiting for him to come to her, she came around the other side of the boulder, catching Blackwood by surprise. His shot went wide, and Rose's derringer spoke twice in rapid succession. The first bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second caught him center mass, and Augustus Blackwood, terror of the Colorado Territory, dropped to his knees with a look of shocked disbelief. "Impossible!" he wheezed, blood frothing at his lips. "You're just a woman." "Just a frightened little girl playing dress-up." Rose stepped closer, her smoking gun still trained on him. "No," she said quietly. "I'm the daughter of every woman you've destroyed. I'm the voice of every girl who couldn't speak for herself. I'm justice, Mr. Blackwood, and justice doesn't care how much money you have." Blackwood tried to raise his gun for one final shot, but the strength was leaving his arms. He toppled forward, his weapon clattering uselessly against the rocks. "The evidence!" he gasped. "You'll never— the judges are mine. The system—" "The system's about to change," Rose said firmly. "Starting now." Augustus Blackwood died with his eyes wide and staring, finally understanding that some things couldn't be bought, some people couldn't be broken, and some debts could only be paid in blood. The gunfire from below had stopped, and Rose could hear Daniel calling her name. She emerged from behind the boulder to see him striding up the slope, his face tight with worry, until he spotted her standing over Blackwood's body. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands gentle as he checked her for wounds. "Not a scratch," Rose replied, though she was surprised to realize she was trembling now that the danger was past. "What about his men?" "Dead or scattered," Daniel said grimly. "Amazing how quick hired guns lose their enthusiasm when the man paying them stops breathing." Rose looked down at Blackwood's corpse, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. "It's over," she said quietly. "This part is," Daniel agreed, "but we still have work to do." They spent the next hour gathering the scattered documents, making sure nothing had been damaged in the firefight. The evidence was intact. Every name, every bribe, every detail of the criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. As they prepared to leave the mining claim, Rose took one last look at the place where her father had hidden his guilty secrets. But this time, instead of shame, she felt a strange kind of peace. She transformed his legacy of cowardice into something redemptive, his sins into justice. "Where do we take it?" Rose asked as they mounted their horses. "Who can we trust with something this big?" Daniel had been thinking about that very question. "There's a federal judge in Denver, Judge Martha Crane. She's one of the few who can't be bought, and she's got the jurisdiction to issue warrants across the entire territory." "How do you know she can't be bought?" Daniel's smile was grim. "Because Blackwood tried to buy her 3 years ago, and she had his messenger thrown in jail for attempted bribery." The ride to Denver took 2 days, during which they encountered no pursuit from the remnants of Blackwood's organization. Word traveled fast in the territory, and news of the crime boss's death had apparently convinced his surviving lieutenants that discretion was the better part of valor. Judge Martha Crane was a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened in growing amazement as Rose and Daniel laid out the evidence, document by damning document. "My God," she breathed, examining a list of bribes paid to federal officials. "This goes all the way to Washington. Senator Morrison, Marshall Williams, Judge Patterson. I've had dinner with these men." "And now you can have them arrested," Daniel said firmly. Judge Crane nodded slowly. "It'll take time to build the cases, to coordinate with federal authorities, to ensure we don't tip off any remaining conspirators. But yes, this is enough to destroy Blackwood's entire network." "What about the girl?" Rose asked urgently. "The ones who are still being held?" "We'll organize raids on every location mentioned in these documents," Judge Crane promised. "Federal marshals, territorial militia if necessary. Within a month, every woman and child being held by this organization will be free." Rose felt tears of relief streaming down her face. 27 names in her father's records, but dozens more who had suffered since. All of them would have a chance at freedom now. 6 months later, Rose stood in the parlor of a small ranch house outside Denver, watching through the window as Daniel worked with their horses in the corral. The trials were over, the convictions secured, the network dismantled. 37 women and children had been freed from Blackwood's operations, reunited with families or given new lives with people who would care for them properly. The infamous Ghost had officially retired, accepting a position as Deputy U.S. Marshal for the Colorado Territory. Law enforcement done properly this time, with accountability and justice. Rose had used her share of the reward money to establish a foundation for women fleeing dangerous situations, giving them the kind of help she desperately needed during her darkest days. "Mrs. Morgan," called a familiar voice from the kitchen, "that apple pie's ready to come out of the oven." Rose smiled, still not quite used to her married name. The wedding had been small but beautiful, held in the same Denver church where Judge Crane had presided over the trials that brought justice to so many victims. Daniel entered through the back door, his face lighting up when he saw her. Even after 6 months of marriage, Rose's heart still skipped when he looked at her like that, like she was the most precious thing in his world. "How was town?" she asked as he pulled her into his arms. "Good news," Daniel said, his smile wide. "Got word from Judge Crane. They found the last of Blackwood's operations, a mining camp up in Montana. Freed 14 more women." Rose closed her eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude. 14 more. 14 more who get to go home, Daniel agreed, his arms tightening around her. 14 more who get to rebuild their lives. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains that had once represented danger and desperation, but now symbolized home and hope. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked softly, echoing the question from their first night together. Rose considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had brought her here. Lady Rosalind Ashworth was gone, and Rose Valentine, the saloon girl, was just a memory. In their place stood someone new. Rose Morgan, wife, advocate, survivor. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one. Even about dancing in that saloon? About everything that happened before?" Rose smiled up at him. "Especially not about the saloon. If I hadn't been dancing that night, you never would have seen me. You never would have known I was worth saving." Daniel's laugh was warm and full of love. "Rose Morgan, you've got that backwards. You weren't worth saving because I saw you dancing. I saw you dancing because you were already worth saving." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rose reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with 5 desperate words, "I'm not what you think I am," and it had led to love, justice, and a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Some secrets, Rose had learned, were worth keeping, but some truths were worth any risk to reveal. And sometimes, if you were very brave and very lucky, love could indeed conquer everything, even the most dangerous truth of all. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Rose Morgan smiled, knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the man who'd been worth risking everything to love. And so across these unforgiving frontier lands, another tale drifts away with the wind. A story of how a saloon girl's whispered truth became the most dangerous weapon against an empire of corruption, and how love conquered not just fear, but the entire criminal network that thought it was untouchable. Rose Valentine started as a woman hiding behind someone else's name, dancing for coins while her soul slowly died from shame and desperation. She was Lady Rosalind Ashworth in disguise, a refugee from privilege who'd lost everything when her father's gambling debts caught up with him. But when she whispered those 5 fateful words, "I'm not what you think I am," to a mysterious stranger in a smoke-filled saloon, she set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of dozens of women trapped in Augustus Blackwood's network of human trafficking and corruption. Daniel Morgan, the ghost of Colorado Territory, could have been just another legend who appeared when justice was needed and vanished like smoke when the job was done. He could have rescued Rose and ridden away into the sunset, leaving her safe but unchanged. Instead, he saw something in her that even she didn't recognize yet. The courage to stand and fight instead of run and hide. The strength to transform shame into purpose, fear into fury. But here's what made their love story truly extraordinary. It wasn't about a man saving a helpless woman or a woman reforming a dangerous man. It was about 2 broken people who found in each other the missing pieces they needed to become whole. Rose didn't just survive because Daniel protected her. She thrived because he believed she was worth protecting. Daniel didn't just find redemption because Rose loved him. He found it because loving her reminded him why justice mattered in the first place. And Augustus Blackwood? Well, sometimes the most fitting end for a man who treated people like property is to be brought down by the very person he thought was powerless. Rose's final confrontation with Blackwood wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving that some things can't be bought, some people can't be broken, and some truths are powerful enough to topple entire empires of evil. The evidence Rose and Daniel risked everything to retrieve didn't just free 37 women from immediate danger. It exposed a network of corruption that reached from frontier mining camps all the way to the halls of power in Washington, D.C. judges, senators, Federal marshals, all brought down by the meticulous records of a dead English lord who'd finally found the courage to document his own sins. But beyond the action, beyond the gunfights and dramatic escapes, this story asks a question that echoes across the centuries. What would you do if you discovered you had the power to save people you'd never met, at the cost of everything you'd built to protect yourself? Rose could have taken Daniel's offer of safety and disappeared into a new life somewhere. Blackwood would never find her. Instead, she chose to use her father's evidence to bring justice to every woman whose name appeared in those damning documents. That choice, to risk personal happiness for the sake of strangers, that's what transformed Rose from victim to hero. That's what made her worthy of a love story that ended not with a wedding, but with a life dedicated to helping other women escape the kind of danger she'd faced herself. So here's what I want to know from you, the folks who've ridden this trail with us tonight. Have you ever been faced with that kind of choice? A moment when you had to decide between personal safety and doing what was right for others? When you had to choose between hiding who you really were and standing up for what you believed in, even if it cost you everything? Maybe you've met someone who saw through the mask you wore to survive, who recognized the person you could become if you had the courage to stop pretending. Maybe you've been the one doing the seeing, recognizing strength and worth in someone that society had written off. Maybe you've had to make the terrifying choice to trust someone with your most dangerous truth. And here's the deeper question. What makes a person worth saving? Is it their past, their bloodline, their social standing? Or is it something deeper? Their capacity for growth, their willingness to fight for others, their refusal to let circumstances define their worth? Rose taught us that it doesn't matter if you start as a saloon girl or a lady. What matters is who you choose to become when the world gives you a chance to be something more. Daniel showed us that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is help someone else discover their own heroism. Tell us in the comments, what's your most dangerous truth? What would you risk everything to fight for? Have you ever had to reinvent yourself completely to survive, only to discover that your new identity was who you were meant to be all along? If this story of courage, love, and frontier justice touched something in your heart, if it reminded you that even the most powerless person can change the world when they find the right partner to stand beside them, then smash that like button, ring that notification bell, and subscribe for more tales of the American West, where love was the bravest weapon of all. Because out here in the Wild West of the human heart, there are still so many stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when love demands it of them. Stories of redemption and second chances, of justice served and truth revealed, of the moment when two souls recognize each other across a crowded saloon and know their lives will never be the same. Until next time, keep your hearts open to dangerous truths, your courage ready for when justice calls, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can whisper is simply who you really are. This is Wild West Stories, where every sunset promises a new beginning, every saloon holds a secret, and every love worth having is worth risking everything to protect. Ride safe, partners. We'll see you on the next trail.